Welcome to Tommy Solo's Famous Friends. This is where I get to chat with people who I've connected with over the years in the world of arts and entertainment, and today I'm very thrilled and excited to have on the show singer, songwriter, musician, author, and producer, Greg Godovitz. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Well, after that intro, I'm going to give myself a raise.
I think you need a raise after all you've done in the biz.
Yeah, well, I've certainly been doing it long enough, Tommy. I started playing at 13 in 1964. I was in my first band, and a real band. I was playing with Brian and Ed Pilling that would eventually go on to go to England and then come back, and then we put Fludd together. So, you know, even I think by the time I was 14, I was playing at after-hours clubs on Yonge Street. So we'd start at 1 o'clock in the morning and play till 3, mostly to, as they called them, Yonge Street rounders, which were ne'er-do-wells and hookers. So it was quite an education for a 14-year-old kid too. And then, we were sitting in with the band. They were Levon and the Hawks back then.
I was going to ask, if you're on Yonge Street back in that day, were you ever a Hawk?
Well, I became a Hawk years later, but my mother was a co-check girl at Friar's Tavern, so I started going down when I was 13 to Saturday matinees, and I was watching, people like, Levon and the Hawks, and I met David Clayton Thomas there, and I met Robbie Lane there, and I saw, I think it was Lionel Hampton I saw play there. I mean, it was just Ramsey Lewis. It was just incredible education for a young kid. And I would, have my chips and a Coke and sit in the women's section because they had two distinct sections. There was the rounders part where my aunt did the clothes. She was hot. And then my mom, who was also hot, did the women's section because they wouldn't let the women and the men sit together at that time. That's how archaic it was back then.
I remember there used to be a ladies and escorts lounge in certain bars. Yeah,
that's true. And then what happened was in the winter months, I would sneak in the side door and I would hide in the fur coats and watch the bands at nighttime. And my mom would let me sneak in and do that. And I remember coming home. I was hanging around Yorkville a lot. This would be I guess I was about 17, maybe. And I came home and she said, "Do you know a guy named Bob Dylan?" And I said, "Well, I know who it is, Bob. Why?" She goes, "Well, he's been hanging around with Robbie and Levon and the boys the last couple of nights. And tonight when we closed, he jammed with them." She goes, "He's not much of a singer." And she wasn't square. I mean, my mom was hip. She knew all the guys in Creedence Clearwater. I mean, she turned me on to the Rolling Stones. I was playing in the street when the Stones were on Mike Douglas' show in '64, and she called me, "Gregory, come in and have a look at these guys," and instantly turned me, into a Beatles and a Stones fan. So she was really hip. But when you think about it, she's absolutely right. He's not much of a singer,
No, he's certainly more of a poet than a singer, that's for sure.
He's certainly that. But she got to witness history. Seeing him play with the band, the guys that become the band, she got to witness that for the first time they ever played together, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about Bob Dylan and his singing voice. I came to the realization at some point in my own musical career that one of the reasons that I don't feel like I had as many opportunities is because I didn't sound weird. Like all the most famous singers in the world have something really distinct. Elvis Presley, Steve Perry from Journey, Johnny Cash even, Bob Dylan. They just have something really different, and you're either going to love it or hate it. Like Neil Young, he's really one of those guys that you either love or hate.
It's funny you bring up Elvis because we went to the movie theater to see it when it first came out, the day it opened, and I loved it. But I watched it last night again because Crave has got it on for free. So great, let's watch it. 2 hours and 40 minutes. And I saw so much more in it. But you talk about the distinctive voices in music. How many people can sound exactly like Elvis Presley? I mean, there are Elvi, millions of them all over the world. These guys that go to the Elvis conventions and stuff. And everybody seems to be able to do a good Elvis impression. But you don't see a lot of Leonard Cohen guys out there.
That's true.
There's a voice I really don't understand. Somebody please explain Leonard Cohen to me. I just and God rest him. I mean, I know he's a great poet and all that, but as a singer, maybe not.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, that's very interesting when you think about it. Man, singers So many different distinctions and styles and so on. Now, you've been more or less known over the years for your athletic, high energy stage presence. I was watching some videos, some old videos of you, um, Chum City TV on the new music at that
Yeah.
church. They introduced you as a heavy metal band, and I found that to be. I didn't really consider Goddo to be heavy metal. I thought you guys were like a rock and roll band, really, but
They also lumped us in with the punks. You know, I kept everything. My archives are like they're at museum quality. They've been curated, and I found an early A&M blurb about Greg Godovitz and his punk pals. And this was before that term was coined. We're talking 1975 here, and we got lumped in with that. But I mean, we were hardy. I think it had more to do with attitude than anything, and the fact with Goddo, we were extremely loud. I wouldn't call this metal. I mean, I put Goddo together to be the Beatles meet Creed. That's what I envision Goddo be. It is a three-piece band, but with the fact that Marty Morin was with us in the early days and could sing like a bird, I could hear the harmonies in the music. I was just coming out of Fludd, of course, which is like a Beatlesque band. So I envision Goddo as a three-piece Beatles meets Creed,
right. Yeah, I can see that. I can see that for sure, yeah.
It's funny, when Colin Brunton, who did the Last Pogo, the famous documentary about the last show at the Horseshoe, where all the famous Toronto first-generation punk bands played, they did a movie called The Last Pogo Jumps Again, and he contacted me and he said, I'd like to interview you for the follow-up movie. And I said, well, I didn't have anything to do with that, except for nurturing those kids in those bands. Because, we would do dates with Teenage Head and with the Ugly and the Curse and the Vile Tones. I really like those kids. I thought they had fabulous energy. And he said, that may be true musically, because we could actually play. I had a guitar player that could play lead,
Right, yeah.
Not taking anything away from Gordy because he became a great guitar player. But he said that to a man, everybody that he interviewed said, you should really talk to Greg because we were just, pretending he was for real. And I think about it and I go, yeah, I guess that's sort of true because some of the stuff I did even freaked them out. I can't really get into it on a family show, but,
right.
I remember doing a couple of things at their parties where they went, what the hell is this guy doing, So I can see that, we sort of set precedents in a way without really attempting to or trying on purpose to make these things happen.
Yeah, I can see where the producers would be interested in talking to you because you obviously have a really good recall and you were there for so much of it.
Well, that's why I've written 2 books so far and I'm working on a 3rd. For a guy my age, I shouldn't remember my name, but I remember specifics from 50 years ago. Of course, ask me what I had for dinner last night, and I'm going to have to yell upstairs and say, hey, Mrs. Claypool, what was it you made me? Actually it was fish, but you know what I mean? Like my short-term memory, not so good. My long-term memory, and I know for a fact that, the late, great Ronnie Hawkins, same way. That guy can remember names and incidents going back 60 years. And George Chevelle is the same way.
I interviewed Ronnie Hawkins a couple of times. In fact, I believe I was the last person to interview Ronnie. And I came away both times thinking he's still the king of the one-liners. And the stories he had to tell, man.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They broke the mold when they made him, man. There's no doubt about it.
And can you believe that a few months before he died, he did a cover of Me and Bobby McGee with Chris Christopherson, Willie Nelson, and Gordon Lightfoot in his living room?
Oh, yeah. I was up there. I wasn't there for that session, but I was up one day when Gordon and Chris were both there, and Ronnie. And it was funny because Gordon was walking around the room with the acoustic guitar. And he came up to me, and people were all talking and laughing and stuff the way they do with Ronnie's. And Gordon says to me, Greg, am I in tune? And he played me the strings, and I said, well, you're close enough, Gordon, but no one's listening anyway. And then Ronnie said, hey, he's got a guitar. Everybody shut up. He's going to play something. And then he proceeded to play a brand new song. So that was a real moment for me, like to all of a sudden, first of all, have him ask my opinion, and secondly, play us something that no one had ever heard before. There was always someone great hanging around at Hawkins' place. I can remember when I was his band leader for a couple of years, I'd phone and ring and, yeah, can I speak to Ronnie Hawkins? And I say, yeah, can I ask who's calling? It's Levon Helm. And, of course, I'm like freaking because it's Levon Helm. But you could tell that he was having lots of problems with his throat. And that's eventually what took him out, was the throat cancer. But you could hear that that great voice had been silenced, you know?
Really, yeah, yeah. It's unfortunate, so many of our peers have not looked after themselves, and smoking. That's a big one, right? Smoking and drinking, and it's taken away so many people way too soon.
Dude, I've been trying to kill myself for 50 years now. And I just can't quite, that's something I just can't quite accomplish.
Well, one of the things that Ronnie Hawkins said to me was that not many people put as many things into their body as he did and made it to 86.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
that's true. That is the truth. I mean, when I read some of my own stories in the books, and people always come up to me and they said, it's incredible that you're still alive. Because, I thought nothing of riding around on the tops of cars 100 miles an hour or, jumping from balcony to balcony 30 floors up in a hotel. I mean, those were everyday common occurrences when we were on the road.
Rock and roll.
The amount of times that I should have fallen off or dropped, 30 floors. I won't even get on a step ladder now. That's the reality has finally set in. You really shouldn't do those things.
Yeah, no kidding.
So, boy, if anybody's got a guardian angel, then I certainly do. I'll tell you that.
So, about the books, Greg, I was thoroughly entertained by Travels with My Amp, and there's another, and now the new book.
Well, the second book has been up for a few years now. It's called Up Close and Uncomfortable.
Okay.
Much like you're feeling right now. And I started to write because Travels ended in 1984. So I started to pick up where I left off because I had diaries and, newspaper clippings and pictures and everything. And I started to write it, and I wrote about 150 pages. And it was just more of the same, And I thought, how many blow stories can people swallow? So I decided to change tack, Found a whole bunch of short stories I'd written over the years and updates on what's happening with Goddo and changed the direction of the book. And I was really worried when I put it up because I thought, this isn't as lascivious as the first book is. It's not as, like when I read a rock book, I don't give a rat's ass that Eric Clapton's Aunt Tilly gave him his first guitar. I want to read about how he knocked off George Harrison's wife, okay? So I really don't care about that early stuff. So I was very worried about putting up the second book until people started writing to me and said, we found this book funnier than the first one. So I guess I never suspected I would become a humorist. But, I've always had a great sense of humor anyway. I know how to make people laugh. My new book I'm writing actually the third one.
Right.
It's called The Idiot's Trilogy, Part 4. And once again, it's extreme. I mean, Mrs. Claypool, my gal, I can't remember her real name, but I call her Mrs. Claypool. She'll hear me howling with laughter in my office. And she comes in, she goes, what are you laughing at? And I said, well, read this. And it's it's a story about tragedy, And she goes, how can you turn something so horrible into something so funny? I said, well, it's that old adage, time plus tragedy equals comedy.
I guess so.
Some of the best comedians. I watched this great special on Sam Kinison yesterday. When he was screaming all that stuff about that woman he was with, he wasn't joking. He was serious. He just had a great delivery and made everybody laugh at his misfortune, And I guess that's sort of what I've learned how to do as well.
Well, if we can't laugh at ourselves, who can we laugh at, right?
Well, I would spend the whole day in front of a mirror just pointing and laughing if that was the case. So, by the way, I just found one of Mrs. Claypool's cigarettes and a lighter under my couch here.
Oh, boy.
I'll have to save that one so I can roll a joint with it at some point. Okay. What's next on the schedule?
Next on the schedule. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the trip to the mansion with Virgin Records.
All right.
Now, if my memory serves me, Michael Oldfield was there working on Tubular Bells. And,
he was,
and you had, editor's note, the musical composition Tubular Bells that Michael Oldfield was attempting to write while sharing accommodations in the castle in England with Greg Godovitz and the boys from Fludd was eventually to become the theme song for the 1973 horror thriller movie The Exorcist that starred Lee J. Cobb, Max von Sydow, Ellen Burstyn, and a very young Linda Blair. Now, back to the show. You came real close to taking that masterpiece away from the world.
Well, not all of it, just one sheet of it, you know. How that story developed was I was an avid reader of the English pop press since the Beatles days. You know, there was always a place you could buy Melody Maker or New Music Express at one of the downtown stores. And then one day I opened up, I think it was Melody Maker. There was a 2-page spread on, they had an aerial view of the manor and didn't mention Richard Branson because nobody knew him at the time. And this was the first of the studios where you could, like a residential studio, where you could book in, record, and stay there and cause trouble. So I showed it to the Pilling brothers, and I showed it to Skinny, William Tanner, manager. And a month later, we are the first band from out of England, especially the first Canadian band, to go and spend a couple of weeks recording at the Manor. And we met all of Richard's original cronies, Simon Wallace, all the guys who ended up working for Virgin for many years. And there was this young hippie guy there. Now, they expected us to show up there looking like lumberjacks. And of course, Fludd was already well ensconced in the whole glam rock trip, because I'd been to England just when it all started happening, T-Rex and Bowie and everything, and came back with all this really flash gear, you know. And 2 weeks later, we're back in England shopping again. You know, I mean, the Pillies just went, where the hell did you buy this? Because I went to England on my own the first time and just went shopping. So we show up and we're off the plane looking like we just came off stage or just going on stage, you know. And the girls that work there, they really like that. we were popular. But Mike Oldfield, you know, if you tried to talk to him, it was like just this sort of sneer, you know. And I realized now it's because the guy was so focused on what he was doing. And we would hear every day when we went to the pub to get drunk before dinner, he would be in the studio using our equipment, recording Tubular Bells. So one night I come into the living room and he's sitting down where there's this big stone hearth and he's doing his music, which didn't look like proper notation. It was sort of this chicken scratch stuff. I can't read music anyway, so I didn't even know what I was looking at. He had a whole raft of them on the table. And I do a running discourse and I said, hey, you know, Mike, it's awful cold in here. And he's grunting at me. And I said, I'll get the old fire stoked up here, you know, get it nice and toasty for you in here. You know? And he's grunting away and they're not even looking at me. I said, well, I got everything ready. I said, I just need something to get it going with. So I reached behind me and grabbed a sheet of Tubular Bells and lit it on fire and stuck it in the fire. And, well, he screamed loudly and leaped over the table and started dancing into the fireplace to stomp out the fire on his music. And I went, oh, shit, was that your music?
And is that my guitar? Yeah.
After that, the guy would, if I walked into a room, he disappeared, man. In retrospect, I mean, can I say assholic? What a horrible thing to do to another musician. You know, as a guy that worked with English people, they call it stitching you up. I guess that was the ultimate stitch up. But, you know, he got the last laugh because, he became a multimillionaire based on that music, and I'm still broke.
Yeah. Isn't that the way? Right, yeah.
But we got to hear the completed Tubular Bells before anybody. We got to hear the finished thing. And I remember when we went to see The Exorcist, I had Lee DiCarlo, who was the American engineer that was working on the album with us. Lee would go on to do the Double Fantasy album with John Lennon and a bunch of stuff in New York. And Anique, who was one of the chambermaids at the Manor, Lee married her. And I think my first wife was with me at the time. All we could get in the theater was front row at the University Theater, which is a big theater. So we're like looking up, you know, and the first thing we hear is the piano come on from Tubular Bells. And the three of us instantly, like out of a movie, we just looked at each other, you know, because we knew what it was. Nobody else in the theater knew what that music was, but we did. So I've always sort of felt guilty about that whole thing, but not really. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, he survived. Yeah. You know, I sort of survived. Richard Branson. I got a great picture of Richard Branson leaving CFRB with a copy of my book under his arm, and it's bookmarked to the place where I talked to. So I have to wonder if he ever showed it to Mike. You know?
Yeah, really. It's interesting when you talk about not being rich. I was offered a record deal when in my early 20s, and I had an uncle who was an entertainment lawyer, and he handled people in the States like Kenny Rogers and so on, and he advised me not to sign it. And I said, why? He said, well, because this money they're going to give you is a loan. And he says, and if they don't promote your record, you're going to be in debt for this money. So I didn't sign it.
Yeah.
And then it turns out that's the deal that everybody got. You know?
Was your uncle an entertainment lawyer?
Yeah, he was. Yeah.
He wasn't a very good one. There's two things you watch out for: is how you're paying the royalties back, whether they're recoupable or not, and avoid the words "in perpetuity" at all costs. Because I've signed a number of those over pinball machines where people from 40 years ago still owed my ass.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, it's interesting. I signed a distribution deal a few years ago with Bullseye Records, and I know you've had a history with them. And I looked at the contract and I just laughed, and I thought, not really anything I can do or say about it. It is what it is. And then it ended up not coming to fruition anyway. But
yes, I think I'll bite my tongue on that one.
that said, you've done a lot over the years with a lot of different acts, and I'm curious, how did Ed Pilling go from Cat Stevens' band to hooking up with you?
Well, I was in grade 9 with Brian Pilling. That's where I met him. He was greasy. I had the only official Beatle haircut in 1964 in the school. I was the first guy to have a Beatle haircut. The picture of it's in Travels in my head. I look a lot older than 13 in that photograph, but I was just a kid. And I remember we had, I think they called it twerp day or something, where anybody over grade 9 could order you around. I really didn't feel like spending the afternoon rolling an egg down the hallway with my nose. So Brian and he showed up with his hair combed down, with a suit jacket on, and all of a sudden, we were the Beatles in A Hard Day's Night. And we went running across the field, pretending that we were being chased by screaming girls, and then collapsing together on the ground and instant best friends. Now I've got someone I can relate to in school. And he was just learning how to play the guitar. I was just learning how to play bass. He said, my big brother Ed's coming back from England in a couple of weeks. We should form a band. So I remember we went to a place that it's a Wimpy's now, but it was a little Greek-owned Greasy Spoon. Brian and I went there one night waiting for Ed to return. And we sat down at a table and we just kept talking about what our plans were and how we were going to be the Beatles. And I think we didn't really notice the time. We also didn't notice that nobody was serving us, And Ed comes in, and he was a vision. He's like 6'3". He's got longer hair than we had little Beatle cuts. He's got like a Rolling Stones, Brian Jones thing happening. And he's got a pea jacket on. He looked like an English pop star, And he sits down, and Brian says, "Where have you been?" He goes, "The bus drivers wouldn't pick me up." So this is a 17-year-old guy. No, probably 16. I think he's got 3 years on me. I was 13. The bus drivers wouldn't pick him up. He had to walk from his mom and dad's place to where we were.
Because he had long hair.
He called the woman over, and he says, "We'd like some menus." And she goes, "We don't serve your kind in here." And he says, "I don't want my kind. I want a hamburger." And then she said, "You either leave now or we're calling the police." So, that's what our lives were like in 1964 when you had just a little clean Beatle haircut. People wouldn't serve you. People tried to beat you up. There were certain areas of Toronto where we would go to the Luttrell Loop, which is where the streetcars turned around to go downtown. And we would get off at Pharmacy and walk over to Dawes on a back road rather than go into the Luttrell Loop, because right beside the Luttrell Loop was the Gogin, which is where all the grease balls went. And if they saw you, they would beat the hell out of you. And if they had scissors, they'd cut the hell out of you too. It's a different time, but it's almost like what you think what Afro-Americans went through in the States, in the southern states. It was almost like the same kind of prejudice and hatred for anybody that looked a little bit different,
Yeah, no kidding. I remember back in the early 80s, I got into a little bit of trouble with the law. And the first thing that my lawyer told me to do before you go to court, get a haircut.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. Magistrates didn't want to see it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I was only 15 when Brian and Ed went back to England. And my parents were pretty good about letting me do stuff because, I was, even though I was brought up in Scarborough, I was a downtown kid. I delivered copies down there, young in Dundas, and, when I was a child. My parents let me sleep out when I was 12 to get Beatles tickets. I was on my own, 12, sleeping out in front of Maple Gardens. So it was pretty lax.
Yeah, no kidding.
But they weren't about to let their 15-year-old go off to England. So the next thing I know, Brian and Ed get a job backing up Cat Stevens. He's already had one, I think Matthew and Son was his first hit, and then he did I Love My Dog. And you can find it on YouTube, Cat Stevens at the Paris Olympia. And there's Brian at 15 or 16 playing guitar and singing harmony with him. Ed's not in it because Ed was the lead singer in the band. He wasn't the drummer. So he would play his bit with the band, and then Cat would come on. And also Ed would be visually distracting because, Cat is a little swarthy Greek guy, and Ed is this blonde, tall Adonis, Brian Jones-looking guy. So Ed disappeared. So he's not in the video, but he was with them. And then when they came back from England, I'd already been through the blues phase and the psychedelic phase with, working with Eddie Schwartz and working with the guys that became Whiskey Al. And then I went to a high school gig where Fludd was playing. I'd never seen them. And after 2 songs, I went, I got to get into this band. And they fired the guy they had, and I went in, and the rest is a mystery.
And I really want to hear the rest of that story, Greg, but I think we're going to have to do that on part 2. So until part 2, cheers.
Well, that's great, because part 1 was fantastic. And hang on a second. Mrs. Claypool, I'm doing part 2, so prepare the invoice.
Well, that was a lot of fun, and I can't wait for part 2. I hope you're looking forward to it as well. Now, here, without further ado, from Goddo, Pretty Bad Boys is Pretty Bad Boy. And don't forget, kids, you can get Goddo music wherever fine music can be purchased. Now, enjoy Pretty Bad Boy.
Maybe we could make eyes after the show.
Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a one-man production, meaning that I've done all the work, including guest acquisition, recording, editing, and so on. And hey, if you like the show, why not subscribe and help support us through Patreon at patreon.com/TommySolo. The theme song for Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a clip from my original composition, The Burn. All rights reserved. And you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks for listening, and until next time, cheers.